Welcome, everybody. This is Jason from 1939bruins.com. Today, I have a chance to feature one of the top Kenny Washington collectors in the country, Jeremy Swick. So, Jeremy, welcome. And why don't you introduce yourself to the audience?
Jason, so I thank you so much, and I appreciate you having me on. I'm really excited to talk a little Kenny Washington, and I'd love to introduce myself. So, my name is Jeremy Swick. I was the historian at the College Football Hall of Fame down in Atlanta, Georgia. I've worked at museums all over the country, including the Pro Football Hall of Fame, first as an intern, then helping out with the Super Bowls and just various other projects they might have around the country.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic. Now, I've heard about Swick Media. Do you want to say a little bit about that? Some of the enterprises you've got going?
I would love to. So, building off my experience in museums, one of the things I really realized is that a lot of these museums need social media, need something to help them. But I realized we kept running into the problem. Big businesses, big agencies would come, offer some services, charge us way too much, and it kind of became an issue with every museum I went to. So, utilizing good old YouTube and Google, I started to create content myself, and that kind of emerged into what Swick Media became, which is social media, but primarily now podcast production. Once I left the College Football Hall of Fame, I wanted to find a way to stay connected with sports, and especially college football, but history in general. And so part of that was launching a podcast called Into the Unknown, where I interviewed different people on their journeys, learning more about their stories. And Swick Media is just one of those companies that helps produce podcasts, help really take people to the next level.
Yeah, I got to tell you, it's a fantastic podcast. I think it's fair to say I came for the podcast and stayed for the Kenny Washington, right? Once I realized you were a big Kenny Washington fan and collector. So that's fantastic. It sounds like what you're doing is for these organizations, you're taking your marketing knowledge and your social media expertise, combining it with your college football or sports history knowledge, and really giving them something that they can't really get somewhere else.
So I appreciate that, Jason. So much of it is really, for me at least, throughout my career at different museums and all that, it's really just continue to combine my passions, find what I'm interested in, and just kind of going after it. And it's kind of how Kenny Washington ended up becoming a huge interest of mine.
Fantastic. Well, that's exactly where I want to go. But before, and I'm going to put you a little bit on the spot here, I think you were wearing a 1946 throwback Kenny Washington jersey. Am I right? Do you want to show that off a little bit?
Yeah, I sure am. So I was able to pick it up from the NFLshop.com. They had it offered for, a Kenny Washington jersey. And let me grab one more thing I'll show you that I am not wearing currently. And this was also made by the NFL. It is a Kenny Washington Circulate t-shirt, I should say.
Oh, that is fantastic. And that is, I believe, the same photo. Oh, the back too. That is the front, I believe, is the same photo on Dan Taylor's Kenny Washington biography, if I'm right.
It sure is. It
Yeah.
sure is. I was
What
able
a
to
great, what a great picture. What a great
that's the one I don't wear. That's
right. Right.
yeah.
Now, if we were in charge of college football and maybe the NFL, am I right? We might nominate that for the logo.
I would love that.
I would do that. I would do that. So this ties into what I really want to know, which is how did you get interested in Kenny Washington specifically? He's obviously a favorite of yours, both as a historian, but also as a collector. Why Kenny?
Jason, I appreciate that. So, a little bit about my background in education. I got my undergrad in history and more so education. I ended up earning my master's in public history, where I focused on African American history, primarily more of the larger scopes. Of course, I looked at things like civil rights movement and things like that, but it was more how it all combined, including things like Black Power, Black nationalism, all in the backdrop of the Cold War, and just really how those experiences for African Americans were shaped. And it's always tough. I always say I wish I was a scientist sometimes, where I could have a controlled experience, or excuse me, a controlled experiment in just the human narrative. But of course, there's so many things that tie into history that one can't happen without the other. And so, using that, one of the things was my sports background. It kept getting closer and closer, I guess, to the sun in that sense, where I just kept wanting to learn more and more about sports, more and more about history. And through my research, I ended up writing my master's thesis on college football stadiums in the 1920s at Illinois, Indiana, and Minnesota, looking at memorial stadiums. But I kept coming across this name, not obviously in that research, but in my African American history about this guy named Kenny Washington. And I think one of those things, for me at least, he became almost a larger than life figure. You learn about him reintegrating the NFL. Then you learn he was a movie star. Then you just keep learning more and more about him. And I think for me, as the historian and the researcher, people like that in history, again, another man like that is Jackie Robinson. Just learning more and more about their story. I think it takes you to that next level, wanting to learn more and more about their story, if that makes sense.
No, that exactly makes sense. And I love what you say about Kenny. I love what you say about Jackie. I'll add the other man that integrated the NFL 1946, Woody Strode, is ridiculous. If you learn, even beyond what he did with the NFL, his time with the Bruins, his life is absolutely a movie. And I think it's one of the things that draws me in as well, right? With all these guys, and we'll get to this at the end of the interview. I want to save this for the end. These guys, other than Jackie, aren't really household names, sadly enough, right? And when you think about their contributions, it's crazy that they're not household names. But then when you learn even more, it's even crazier. So we're going to get back to that. But talk to me about the transition to become going from, let's say, a Kenny Washington fan to a Kenny Washington collector, because you've absolutely mastered that art.
I appreciate it. I love that you mentioned Woody, and it's funny because, as you mentioned, it's like a movie. The fact that they all knew each other, they all played together, that in some aspects a lot of them grew up together, or at least knew of each other. It's again, it's a film set for Hollywood, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And of course, all those guys had big parts in movies in Hollywood as well. So kind of a funny coincidence, but why wouldn't you cast those guys, right? Um,
Exactly.
yeah.
Well,
So what were some of the first Kenny Washington items you got? I'm going to tell you on my end, right? When I first learned about him, it was kind of like, I didn't even know there would be cards, right? I didn't even realize there would be things to collect, right? Because there isn't a lot from football in those days. So it was like, wow, this guy's got a card. That's sort of how I jumped in. But tell me your story in terms of becoming a collector.
yeah, absolutely. I'll have to go back a little farther. So I've collected my whole life. You can see my background. There's quite a few
Oh, yeah.
trinkets and pieces of sports memorabilia, and this is kind of just scratching the surface. But I grew up collecting sports cards, and of course, unfortunately for me, it was the '90s era. A lot of junk wax, but it kind of fostered that love for collecting in me. And I always tell people I was kind of like that kid who kind of grew up, but never really grew up. And through the historical lens, I started gravitating towards vintage and truly vintage World War II era football cards. And so I started with the exhibit card set, which, fun fact, they were the first football cards made solely for the idea of collecting, not as a premium for gum, tobacco, cigarettes, or anything like that. And I
Mhm.
just kind of was enamored with those. And again, when I leave the Hall of Fame, I'm no longer around all this history. And of course, I had a couple Kenny Washington cards previously. And I think part of it was just grabbing onto something I could collect. Again, as a collector, the cards were the first things that really hit my radar. Seeing that there was only about four or so, not including reprints in the '90s, which made it a little bit more attainable, if that makes sense. Where it's not
Absolutely.
like collecting everything.
Right. Yeah, I got that. So it's funny. I was doing a lot of collecting in the junk wax era as well. So I'm going to guess, right, before you had Kenny in your collection, you probably had Brian Bosworth, Todd Marinovich, and screw down holders, right? That was going to be your
Oh,
retirement back in the day.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thankfully, didn't put too much investment in a lot of those. A big one, and unfortunately, I still have. I'm looking over. I have a lot of Favre rookie cards, and
Okay.
so again, being a kid from Wisconsin, growing up, I've been fortunate. Brett Favre, and then Aaron Rodgers, and now hopefully Jordan Love. We've had three back to back, at least two back to back, really, really good quarterbacks, and Love is hopefully well on his way. But again, collecting those guys, it just made me excited to feel that connection to sports.
Yeah, no doubt. It's been a long time since Dan Mikowski So yeah, Green Bay's been blessed. I'm here in Chicago, so I can't give too much love, right? But no, fantastic. So in terms of your Kenny Washington collection, and I've seen some of the things you have, and to me it's just unreal. But what are a couple of your favorite items, right? And you don't have to stop at a couple if you want to show even more or talk about even more.
We got a few, and I made sure to grab them. But it's funny because I think one of the things, if you really get into collecting, there's always that next level.
Yep.
And once you realize you are the tiniest fish in the ocean, in the multiple oceans, for me, it made it a lot more fun because I'm always curious to see what is out there. I started doing searches on eBay and kind of the more traditional sites because I was like, all right, I have the four cards. I have the two 1948 rookies and the 249 cards. And I was like, okay, what else is out there? And for whatever reason, I started typing in different things on eBay. And the first thing that came up was a high school letter of Kenny's from 1935.
What?
And of course, the person who had it for sale, I learned later they had bought it at a auction house type storage unit thing, but they had the price tag on it for about 10 grand on eBay. And in
Ooh,
my brain, I'm like, well, I can definitely not afford that.
yeah.
But my curiosity is always, what is that? Is that the I don't want to sell it price? Is that the price to appease maybe a significant other saying that, hey, I have it for sale. I'm going to get rid of it. But
Right.
knowing that number won't come to realization. After about a week or two, I got a message, or I should say an offer for much, much lower than 10 grand. And I was like, okay, well, this person is least interested in playing ball.
Yeah.
I kind of inquired more, talking about, and I won't lie, I parlayed my interest in sports history because that sometimes helps or hurts in
Okay.
negotiations.
You
It's a
got it. You got
50-50
it.
double-edged sword, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
I kind of explained what my goal with it was, obviously to keep it in my collection, but eventually hope to have it on loan to the Pro Football Hall of Fame. But eventually we came to a price that was agreeable for both of us. And so I'm gonna pull that out right now and show you.
This is unbelievable. I'll give a quick collector tip, right? Based on that, while you're getting that ready,
Yeah.
is I've scored some really good deals myself, whether it's Kenny or whether it's baseball, which is my main collection, to be honest. Often when the person realizes it's something I'm going to keep in my collection, it's a player I really like, somebody I collect, and I'm not looking to flip it right away, right? Or ever, I should say. I'm not looking to flip it ever. So that is a collector's tip. Oh my goodness. And that is Lincoln High School, right?
That is
We're
it.
taking the L here, but not that kind of L. This is Lincoln High School. Tell me about that.
Yeah, it's his 1935 varsity letter
Good
from
Lord.
his junior year in high school.
Ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. And is there even a story of how one acquires something like that? I mean, obviously, I would
So
think there would only be three total in the universe, right? One per year or something like that. But
and
uh,
so this might be a little difficult to see, but this is the
yeah,
1935 certificate he got.
good Lord. Jeremy.
And it is, it came with it. And in talking to the guy, who I'm not going to give his eBay name because I think he may have more. So
Okay.
he was a great guy, but he knew the Washington family pretty well, and
Okay.
this kind of came up at a storage auction, and uh, it was a different, I should say, probably a different part of the family, but he found that, and it was almost by accident more so that he came across it. It wasn't sitting there in a gold case or anything. It was tucked away and paper clipped together, which the second I got it, I removed the paper clips, obviously.
Hmm.
But it was one of those things where he just had it, didn't really have a use for it, didn't really know a whole lot about it, didn't I don't even know if he was super interested in it per se, but he just knew it was something you probably do a quick Google search, and even that didn't come up with a whole lot. But the fact that I was able to acquire it was just remarkable.
That is absolutely unbelievable. I get asked a lot, if the house was burning down and you could grab one thing, right? What would you rescue? We're not talking family or pets here. We're talking collectibles. And I have to imagine, right? If somehow your entire collection ended up with me, hey, I'm open to it. But if that ever happened, I have a feeling that would actually be it. I think that would be the thing I grab. I don't know. Is that where you're at as well? It just seems so unique.
So it's tough. It's like
Okay.
picking your favorite child.
Oh no.
So this is a 1940 belt buckle that belonged to Kenny Washington that he received from the college all-star team.
Oh wow. My
And how do we know it belonged to Mr. Washington?
what do we got there on the
On the
back?
back,
It's a little hard to read on the screen, so help us out.
I think I can get it.
You make me update my prescription.
All right. Okay. It says K Washington on the back.
You got it. Now let me ask you this, because I've got a game program from something called the Kenny Washington All Stars. They were playing the Ernie Nevers All Stars up at Kezar in San Francisco, and this was pretty much right after Kenny finished his college career. Yeah, that would be the one. I was trying to think of the date, February. So would that be essentially where the belt buckle came from?
So it would actually be before that. This
Okay.
would have been during the when the pro excuse me, when the pros would play the college all-star team in Chicago.
Oh, yes,
It
yes,
was
yes.
it was
Okay.
the game by the Chicago Tribune. They always got the all-star jerseys. And for those kind of hardcore collectors, can imagine the all-star game jerseys and things like that with the all-American type sweaters and things like that. So that's where he likely would have gotten that from.
Absolutely. I got a question for you. It just
Yes,
popped
sir.
into my head, right? But am I right? And I can't remember now if it was Kenny or if it was Jackie, but am I right that one of those guys came to Chicago or maybe even in Wisconsin and played the Packers as part of a college all-star team?
That may have, I believe that was Kenny, if I'm not
Yeah,
mistaken. And one of the things is he kind of hung around Chicago after the All Star game
that's
in
right.
hopes that Hallis was going to sign him, and that had kind of been a verbal, maybe, or talked about
Yeah.
agreement. Of course, it never came to fruition because obviously during that time period there was, I would probably argue, a gentleman's agreement if nothing's been found on paper to not sign specific players.
And gentlemen may be too kind a term,
I
but
disagree.
that is a game you would love to be at, I'm sure, as a Packer fan, as a Kenny Washington fan, right? I mean, that's worlds collide. Who would you root for?
Absolutely. I mean, I would probably be team Kenny Washington. I won't lie. It's tough because, not knowing that era, but in general, the Packers, but those all-star games were something impressive that a lot of people don't know a ton about the sports history and football history. It's kind of hard to wrap your head around the top players would play the defending champions.
Exactly, exactly. Now, one of the things you made me think of, right? You were talking about getting that letter, and it sounds like you got a pretty nice deal on it, considering what it is. And so, another tip I'm just going to throw out there for collectors is deals are out there, right? Sometimes you think about, oh, the thing I want, it's going to be crazy price or whatever. But sometimes you get a little creative. Like, I'm sure there aren't too many Kenny Washington collectors that are doing a search on items like that, right? I mean, they're looking at cards or maybe game programs or things like that. But I'll share just a story. It's probably I shouldn't say probably. It's definitely my top Kenny Washington collectible. I was just scrolling through eBay, not even looking at Kenny Washington, just kind of, doom scrolling all kinds of stuff. And I come to a 1935, coincidentally, Lincoln High School yearbook, and the person advertises it 1935 Lincoln High School, Los Angeles, Robert Preston, actor, right? Well, Robert Preston, the future music man, did go to high school with Kenny, right? Well, anyways, there's only one picture, and it's this picture of the ratty old cover. This thing's not in great shape. He's got no pictures of anything inside. So I write to him, and I didn't really know at the time, I assume Kenny's in there somewhere, but is he in there with like three pictures? Is it just, maybe one tiny little, part of a team photo? So I asked him, could you check for me if Kenny Washington's in there and maybe send me a couple photos? And at any rate, he basically told me he was a little too busy to do that. But, if I want to buy it, I could buy it. So I thought, what the heck? I'm going to roll the dice. Well, the yearbook comes. I paid almost nothing for it, to be honest, right? It is in bad shape, but I'm flipping through. Not only is Kenny pictured in the yearbook something like 6 or 7 times, he's literally signed his photo 5 times, right? So, Kenny Washington is a tough autograph, right? If somebody went on eBay right now, they might see one, right?
Maybe.
Uh, tough autograph. I end up with 5, right? And again, if you were looking Kenny Washington, it wouldn't have come up in your search. Now, if you were looking Robert Preston, it would have come up in your search. But for the Music Man fans out there, I will say I don't believe Preston's signature is in there. He actually went by a different name in high school, but I even checked that. So no Music Man, but five,
But
five
5 Kenny
Kingfish, five
Washington
Kingfish.
signatures. And it's so funny because it's so hard to come by. And the other thing is, not many people are looking at yearbooks like that, but I know exactly what yearbook you were talking about. And I saw there was only one picture, got distracted, kind of forgot about it for a little while, and then
Uh-oh.
I went to check again, and I'm glad it went to a good home. I'll put it that way.
No, I know, man. I mean, that's how it is. It's like when there's so little out there for a guy you collect, your friends in the hobby also can become your rivals, right? So,
So let's see.
okay. So I'm looking at a signature right now.
We're looking at a signature. Let's see if there we
Yeah,
go.
yeah, there you go. That is a beauty, and it's dated. I can't quite make out the date, but
10/28, 1958.
wow, okay, 1958. So, gosh, I know by then Kenny Washington would have been a father. I believe his son was playing quarterback at Dorsey High School, if I'm not mistaken.
I
Uh,
believe so. And
yeah,
again, that was just an eBay find because, like you mentioned, they're out there, deals are out there,
yeah,
and the thing is, and I've realized, as you mentioned, everyone is kind of collecting different things and different objectives, and maybe they have a Kenny Washington piece, but that's not their main collection. So they're just maybe they purchase it knowing it might bring value. They're not allowed, I should say, they're willing to sell because it's not who they collect. It's just
yeah,
something that they acquired. And I do it too because sometimes I see a deal too good to pass up. It maybe doesn't fit in my collection, but I could potentially use that as leverage down the road, or eventually maybe sell it to find another Kenny Washington piece.
yeah. I'll show you. I'll show you part of my modest collection.
I would love to.
So because we know there isn't a lot out there for Kenny. So you can see here, I've got 2 of the 1948 Leaf. I've got the black letter and the white letter. The white being a little bit tougher. Um, but I've got as well. Pardon me. I should say I've got 2 of the black letter 1948. I wish I had a 1949. I don't yet. I've got 2 of the Bowman rookie, and then also 2 of that 1990 reprint that you alluded to. And then, right, because there's so little to come by, I've defined this idea of Kenny Washington adjacent. And so I've got 2 kind of funny items in the bottom row. The first is a Negro Leagues baseball card from 2020 of journalist Hallie Harding. And you would know his story. Hallie Harding had everything to do with Kenny breaking the color barrier with the Rams. So pretty awesome. They just got a baseball card. And then the dean of NFL officials, Jim Tunney. And of course, because you know the Lincoln High history, referee Jim Tunney's father was Kenny's coach at Lincoln. And then because we love the Dan Taylor book, Walking Alone, Jim Tunney Jr., if I can say junior for a guy who's 95 years old and still with us, wrote the foreword to that book talking about how he remembered watching Kenny, right? When Jim Tunney Jr. was a very little kid watching Kenny practice and getting to go to an occasional game. So that's a bit of the modest collection. Let me ask you this.
Yes,
Your
sir.
collection is so off the charts, and it may be that the next big haul of yours is something that today neither of us even know exists, right? But do you have any items on your wish list at the moment?
So for me, it's it would be amazing to have one of his trophies.
Yes.
There's several out there. They're out there. I think a lot of times, probably in private collections,
Yep.
more so than floating around online. But potentially they're out there. I know his all-star helmet is at a museum in California.
Okay. Where it
Doing some.
belongs, though, we'll say
Yep,
where it
yeah,
belongs.
exactly.
Yeah.
And again, being the historian in me, ultimately, I could see passing this down to someone like the Pro Football Hall of Fame, frankly,
Absolutely.
because it's no. I try to explain this to people. They're like, "Oh, it's valuable." I'm like, "Oh, yes, it's very valuable," but to me, it's sharing that history. And right now, I feel like I'm just the curator of that history, and love sharing it. And a jersey would be incredible.
Oh my. Yeah.
Of course, there's always things out there that I've started to kind of think even more. So this is a magazine called Friday.
Okay.
And I found a beautiful article on Kenny. And it was a pretty extensive article in the paper. The general comes back.
Oh, I love it.
And this is actually just highlighting him while he was coaching for UCLA shortly after his.
Oh, he was working with the Frosh team, right? Yeah, 1940. So when is that magazine from then? Is it 1940?
That magazine is from 1940, November 29th, 1940.
Oh my goodness. That is incredible. And again, something that probably folks who have those, there can't be too many anymore, but folks that have those may not even realize that they have a Kenny Washington collectible.
Correct. And it took me some digging to figure that out. I had seen that photo and that little article before online. It was either a reprint or a framed. And I started kind of doing context clues, doing the research, the historical background to figure out what magazine that was. And then through there, I started looking for Friday magazines around what would have been that time.
Yeah.
And I came across it again for a very modest price because, again, I think it was probably one of those bulk collectors or bulk resellers that I have a huge stack of old magazines. Let me go through them.
No, you got that exactly right. I'll give you another Kenny adjacent item, right?
I would love to hear it.
Kenny adjacent item, and I don't have this. I've looked for it every now and then. If I see it and it's a decent deal, I'll probably add it, right? Because again, I'm happy to go Kenny adjacent if I can't find Kenny himself. Kind of random. January 1952, cover of Jet magazine, Kenny's Aunt Hazel. Right. So Kenny was practically raised, I think it's safe to say, by his aunt and uncle, his uncle Rocky and his Aunt Hazel. And there she is on the cover of Jet magazine, having nothing to do with football or Kenny, right? But actually a business that she started with somebody else. So if I see it, I'll grab it, right? But 1952 Jets, you're not going to see those too often.
They don't come up. But again, it's one of those things you could not easily, I should say, as a relative term, but it's something you could see in a flea market with those big bins of old magazines, and you just really never know because, again, no one's looking for it except like 6 of us.
Exactly. Now I got it. I can't do this without a bad joke. So TNT's got Kenny the Jet, right? But my collection maybe someday may have Kenny and the Jet magazine. But
man, I love that. It's funny because, again, I also had to kind of take the sports history lens off, the cap off, the history cap, if you will, and start thinking outside the box of what else might be out there of Kenny's.
Yeah.
And of course, he was a movie star.
Yep.
And it started getting down looking for this. So this is the still from Pinky.
Yes. That is insane. I've never seen one of those. I feel like I know the picture from IMDb, basically.
Yes.
But wow. Oh, good Lord.
And so it was literally one of those movie stills that, they would have. This is the other side, but it was the other actors that were actually highlighted.
Yes.
Kenny wasn't really even mentioned in that specific sales.
Yeah. Hot tip. Kenny's dad, Blue, was in almost 100 films, some of them with John Wayne. And you'll occasionally see Blue Washington associated with a photo that's only labeled John Wayne. So
yes,
that's pretty cool.
It was the 1933 movie. I want to say it was
maybe Haunted Gold.
Yep, Haunted Gold. Yes,
Haunted Gold, yeah.
I just watched a John Wayne movie with my folks the other day, and it's funny because although he's not a household name, pretty much anyone who's in my family or my friends have heard who Kenny Washington is, probably ad nausea at this point, because I'll bring him up in pretty much any conversation I possibly can.
That's what guys like us do. By the way, on the subject of John Wayne and Kenny adjacent, the man who shot Liberty Valance, Woody Strode, has a great role in that movie.
I'll pull this out.
Yeah, let's see what else you got.
So again, this was a interesting find in the sense that I was on a website that looked like it was made in the mid 2000s. It was a movie website.
Okay.
It looked like it'd been on a forum or something like that, and the tech wasn't there, but they had this. And
Ooh,
so it is
that-
a lobby card from Kenny Washington, starring Kenny Washington in Crooked Money, which was the
yes.
rename of While Thousands Cheered.
Insane. I definitely need one of those. Definitely need one of those.
And while that happened, I started and I knew right away in my soul, without going too much research when I first found it, I was like, this is going to be a lost movie for sure. There's no way. Of
That's right.
course, it's one of those that has never been found,
Yep.
likely burned in nitrate or just thrown away because the thing about movies, as I'm sure you know, they didn't keep them. There was
That's right.
no need. Once it was done in theaters, thrown out.
Yeah. Yeah.
But on top of that,
Oh, look at that. And there's Kenny himself. And I think Ruby D. I think,
yes,
or no, Ruby D was in the Jackie Robinson story. Okay. I'm blanking on the name of this co star. I do believe she went to Manual Arts High School in Los Angeles.
I
That's what I,
believe you are correct, and I can't
yeah.
think of her
Not
name off
working.
her top of my head. But yes,
All right. Well, I'll
um,
make sure she gets her due in the notes, because my bad, not Ruby D. Go see the Jackie Robinson story for Ruby D. She's awesome.
and of course I won't go through all these, but
Oh yeah. Yes.
I would estimate I'm probably up to maybe probably 18 or 19 Kenny Washington cards at this present moment. Most are rookies. I got a couple of 49s, and pretty much whenever I see them on eBay, I pick them up and I'll send my cards in to get graded, so they come back every once in a while. And of
Uh,
course, this is a one. It's in pretty poor shape, but
you know what? A poor Kenny is better than a gem mint to just about anybody else. So
exactly,
we're
exactly.
good with that. So let me ask you this,
Yes,
going
sir.
a little bit off the subject of collectibles, right?
Yeah.
And this to me is unbelievable, right? But you've been closer to the sport, closer to the history, so you may have some insights here. I'm going to say, yeah, my friends, they know Kenny Washington because I don't shut up, right? But I feel like I know all these people that are football fans. And I'm going to say your typical football fan, even your typical diehard, literally has never heard of Kenny Washington. Why do you think that is? And then on the flip side, is there anything you think that the league or just folks like us should be doing to raise his profile?
So I think one of those things is it doesn't surprise me terribly because if it's not talked about, if it's not in your team's lexicon like it should be, I think it's something that I wouldn't even expect the average or standard fan to know. I think a lot of times with the NFL, I think for a long time period, it was that uncomfortable mixed message because he didn't break the color barrier, he reintegrated the color barrier,
Right.
which that kind of leads again the black eye on the league, if you will, because they had that period where just no African Americans were allowed to play. So I think a lot of that with them is the desire to not really bring that story up. But I will give credit to the Los Angeles Rams. They came out with that short Kingfish documentary.
Yep.
They recently did this collection with the
Yep.
Rams, and they have started to, and I just acquired this little guy. It was a nice little pin.
Oh, uh-oh. I gotta hit eBay now.
Yeah, it was only about $20, but they're at the store, I believe, in Los Angeles when they were doing this, and this was this last year that they started to come out with these Kenny Washington items and memorabilia. So I'll definitely give credit to the Rams to talk about that story more. And I would love to see the NFL just do something more. And again, if they ever decide to or ever come through with making some sort of movie, obviously a well done movie, I think that could really open the door, open the interest of learning more about Kenny.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you my opinion. Maybe I'm a little bit biased, right? And I grew up in LA. That's important to know, just like Kenny did, right? I grew up right by UCLA, in fact. So my opinion, right, based on everything he's accomplished, in my opinion, Kenny shouldn't just be a name people know, right? I believe Kenny should be a Los Angeles icon. I believe he should be a UCLA icon. I believe he should be a Rams icon, and I believe he should be an NFL icon, right? And at the moment, he is none of those. Now, to us, of course, he is, right? But think about the number of steps or phases between being a guy nobody's ever heard of to being an icon, right? That's a big gap. But in my opinion, that's the status he deserves in every one of those arenas. And so, I try to do my small part. I got 1939bruins.com. I talked to a guy like you that's one of the biggest fans, one of the best collectors out there, and does your part to promote Kenny and his legacy. You hosted Dan Taylor, who wrote that outstanding book. But it is absolutely bonkers to me, right, that a guy that I believe should be an icon 4 times over is literally an unknown name still to even the diehard football fans out there.
I find it really fascinating, and again, I completely agree. Clearly, I'm 100% biased as well in my thoughts on Kenny, but I think and I'm hoping that these little steps, and more people, even the league, talking just a little bit more each year or each time there's an opportunity to share someone like Kenny or like his story. And I think it takes people like you and people like I to share that story to whoever will listen. Really spread the gospel of Kenny Washington and Woody Strode and you know Ray Bartlett and all those guys.
There you go. There you go. Well, let me do this. I loved talking to you. I could probably go 10 hours just talking to you about Kenny, and then we'd move on to Woody and these other guys too. But I'm going to actually throw you a curveball because, Jeremy, I did a little bit of my own research leading up to this interview. Am I right that you were, or maybe still are, a rugby player?
Yes, I am still a rugby player. I've been playing 15 years now. I'm fortunate. I work with USA Club Rugby as sort of a client now. I'm actually headed out to nationals next weekend to excuse me, not to coach, to cover social media coverage for the teams in the championships and just again share that history of rugby and sports and all that good stuff.
Well, fantastic. Then what I'm about to ask you either is going to blow your mind, or you're going to say, come on, Jason, of course I knew that. Okay. So 1948 Leaf set. Are you familiar with Mike Dimitro?
I am. I am. That is awesome. I love that.
So for folks listening that are like, who, I'll just say, right, I was not familiar. I was going through that Leaf set, really just looking, are there other UCLA guys in the set? And of course, there's Bob Waterfield. And besides Kenny, I find this one guy, Mike Dimitra. So I'm like, oh, let me check him out. Let me learn about this guy. So after UCLA, and you know the story probably better than I do, there's a book called No Helmets Required if people want to check that out. But I guess he had the idea to recruit a bunch of fellow college football players or college football alums and basically go to Australia and New Zealand, right? The toughest rugby in the world, and put these guys who never played in matches against these guys. And remarkably, I think they won a few, right? I don't know what their record was. Maybe they won 2 and lost 100, but the point is they won some games, right? And then there's some sort of postscript in terms of coming back to the US and really trying to popularize rugby. But it's just, when we were talking about Kenny, Woody, Jackie, these guys where you learn a little bit and then you go down some rabbit hole because it's just so crazy, all the things they did. I got to say, Mike Dimitro to me, right, is like, here's this guy I'd literally never heard of. He was part of a Bruins undefeated team, so shame on me, right? But then you look and you're like, are you kidding me? So at any rate, I'm guessing that's a card you've got.
Man, I do have it. I was looking for it. I think I might have just got it graded. I'll definitely send you a picture over. I'm working on that Leaf set right now. It's funny you mentioned that because, again, rabbit holes. And at this point, I realized that probably defined my whole career. In high school, I played rugby and found it super interesting. I think even before I was a historian. So I wanted to learn more about rugby. I wanted to learn more about the game. And I actually ended up writing my undergraduate on early American football was the death sentence to rugby in the United States. During 1905, there was the rule changes, line of scrimmage, ways to make the game of football safer. Prior to that, it looked a lot more like rugby, and even before that, it looked a lot more like soccer as we know it. Anyway, fast forward a little bit. 1905, Teddy Roosevelt comes out with the rule changes, save the game, legalize the forward pass. A lot of teams on the West Coast did not really like that. They didn't either think the game was safe enough or they just changed the rules. So a splinter cell, if you will, of them went and started playing rugby. And they would bring in coaches from overseas to train the Stanford and teams like that on more of the rugby game than it was the American football game. This kind of creates about a 10 to 15-year window of a lot of the West Coast playing more rugby than they were playing American football. Of course, that leads us to inviting over Australia. We beat them narrowly in rugby, and we kind of think we're the big tough guys of the rugby world because we beat this supposedly really good Australian team. Well, of course, not far after that, the New Zealand All Blacks. And for anyone who knows rugby or has heard rugby, or at least have maybe seen the haka, the All Blacks are
Yeah.
the team
Oh, of
from New
course. Yeah.
Zealand that made that famous.
Yeah. The
Well,
ritual.
they come to the West Coast and wipe the floor with. I think they outscored their opponents 222 to like 26 or something like that. And most of those points were in one game on clay in a very rainy situation. We end up winning the Olympics in 2020, or excuse me, 1920 and 1924 in rugby. And most of those were California alumni guys from UCLA and Stanford and schools like that that were put together. And they only really beat France and I believe Romania because there was so much else going on and not a lot of people playing rugby. So it's funny that you mentioned that because rugby was actually kind of my first historical lens into early American football, if that makes sense.
It totally does. You are absolute wealth of information. So let me ask you this: if people
Yes, sir.
enjoyed this show and they're like, "Man, I want to follow this guy on social media, or I want to check out his podcast, or whatever it is," what are some things you could drop just for people to find you?
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate that, Jason. So on Instagram and Facebook, you can find me at The Average Historian. I love talking football, sports, kind of life in general. You can follow the podcast on Into the Unknown on Facebook or pod.into the unknown on most social media platforms. If you Google The Average Historian or Jeremy Swick, I should pop up and just feel free to reach out. We have a YouTube channel that we love sharing, of course, Into the Unknown as well. And again, just interviews of people from all walks of life, not just sports, not just history, but I've had everyone on from NFL players to my seventh grade social studies teacher who kind of fostered my love for history and I think pushed me into education and definitely pushed me into history. And it's just, I love sharing people's stories and learning more about their stories.
I listened to that interview with your history teacher. It's really awesome. My wife enjoyed it as well. So now, before people start spamming you, the varsity letter L, that is not for sale. It's not for sale. No need to inquire. All right. Jeremy doesn't need those emails because the day it becomes for sale, he might know a guy.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's funny. I love that you mentioned that because I'm fortunate. I realize in collecting, there's always someone who knows what you have. There's always someone interested, not Kenny related. I have some gamers from Packer players and I like the obscurity. So I have a Vince Young jersey from his 3 weeks on the Packers. And it's funny because Vince knows I have it. And he every once in a while hit me up. He's like, "Hey, you ready to get rid of it yet?" I'm like, "You're gonna be the first to know, my friend, when that time comes." But it's you never know what people have, and it never hurts to ask either. But pretty much any Kenny Washington thing is probably not for sale ever, ever, ever.
Right. Lesson to the college football legends out there, right? If you're the kind of player that would give Jeremy the shirt off your back, he might not give it back to you.
Absolutely.
All right. I think I'm going to close it before I come up with a joke worse than that. Jeremy, fantastic to have you. Literally, I could talk to you all day. Man, you are the GOAT when it comes to Kenny Collectibles, and keep spreading the word. Let's do what we can, right? You and me, to raise his profile, both in the hobby, but more importantly, in the world at large. Take it easy, my man.
Thank you so much, Jason. I appreciate it.
All right. Take care.